Picture a vast military training ground in northern Germany, where armoured vehicles once rumbled across open fields and soldiers drilled in neat formations. The year is 1940, and beneath grey skies, wooden barracks stretch across the landscape like rows of forgotten promises. This is Bergen-Belsen, a place that would soon transform from a simple prisoner of war camp into something far more sinister. A place where the very ground would become saturated with human suffering on an unimaginable scale. What began as a Wehrmacht facility for Belgian and French prisoners would evolve into one of the most notorious concentration camps in Nazi history. By the time British forces arrived in April 1945, they would encounter scenes so horrific that veteran soldiers, men who had witnessed the worst of warfare, would be reduced to stunned silence. Mountains of corpses lay scattered across the compound like discarded dolls. The living, barely distinguishable from the dead, wandered in skeletal procession through a landscape of absolute despair. This is the story of Bergen-Belsen, a camp that held no gas chambers yet claimed more than 50,000 lives. A place where disease became the primary instrument of death, where typhus spread like wildfire through overcrowded barracks, and where the most basic human dignities were stripped away with methodical precision. Here, Anne Frank would spend her final months dying not in the infamous chambers of Auschwitz, but from typhus in a leaking tent, her body reduced to little more than skin and bone. Bergen-Belsen stands apart from other concentration camps, not because it was less deadly, but because its horror took different forms. While other camps operated with industrial efficiency, Bergen-Belsen killed through calculated neglect, through the deliberate creation of conditions so appalling that survival became a daily miracle, through a systematic erosion of humanity that left even the liberating soldiers questioning what they had witnessed. The transformation of this remote training ground began in the spring of 1941, when over 21,000 Soviet prisoners of war were herded into hastily constructed compounds. The Wehrmacht had completed very few huts when these men arrived, forcing them to sleep in the open air, to dig earthwork shelters with their bare hands, to huddle together for warmth as northern German winters bit through their inadequate clothing. Within months, 14,000 of these prisoners would be dead. Think about that number for a moment. 14,000 human beings, each with their own stories, their own families waiting at home, their own dreams of survival, all extinguished in less than a year through starvation, exposure, and disease. This was not the result of battlefield casualties or strategic bombing. This was deliberate murder through systematic neglect, a preview of the horrors that would follow when the SS assumed control. The prisoners who arrived at Bergen-Belsen during these early months found themselves trapped in a nightmare of bureaucratic brutality. Gestapo Einsatzkommando units moved through the camps conducting selections, identifying Jewish prisoners and political functionaries for transport to Sachsenhausen concentration camp and certain death. At least 500 men disappeared in these selections, swallowed by the Nazi killing machine before Bergen-Belsen had even officially become a concentration camp. As Soviet prisoners died in the thousands, their bodies were buried in mass graves that scarred the landscape like infected wounds. The few survivors existed in a state of perpetual terror, watching friends and compatriots succumb to typhus, tuberculosis, and starvation while guards looked on with calculated indifference. This was not the chaos of war, but the methodical implementation of racial ideology that deemed entire populations expendable. In April 1943, everything changed. The SS took control of the southern section of Bergen-Belsen, transforming it from a prisoner of war camp into something uniquely sinister within the Nazi concentration camp system. Unlike Auschwitz-Birkenau or Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen was initially designated as a detention camp, an Aufenthaltslager, designed for a very specific and cynical purpose. The camp would house Jewish hostages, people the SS believed could be exchanged for Germans interned abroad, for foreign currency, or for commodities valuable to the war effort. These were not random victims swept up in mass deportations, but carefully selected individuals chosen for their perceived value in Nazi diplomatic calculations. Dutch Jews with official emigration papers to Palestine, citizens of Allied countries caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. high-ranking officials in Jewish organizations whose freedom might be worth negotiating. For these exchange prisoners, the initial conditions at Bergen-Belsen seemed almost luxurious compared to other concentration camps. They were permitted to bring personal belongings, to wear civilian clothes, to maintain some semblance of normal life. Families could stay together, children could attend makeshift schools. Religious services were conducted in secret, whispered prayers offering hope in a place designed to extinguish it. The SS organised these exchange prisoners into separate compounds with clinical precision. The Star camp housed Dutch Jews, identified by the yellow stars they were required to wear. The Hungarian camp held families from Budapest and other cities. The special camp contained Polish Jews deemed valuable for exchange purposes. The neutrals camp housed prisoners from countries not actively engaged in the war. Each section maintained its own character, its own hierarchy, its own desperate hope for eventual freedom. Between July 1943 and December 1944, at least 14,600 Jewish prisoners arrived at Bergen-Belsen's exchange camp, including nearly 3,000 children and adolescents whose voices would soon be silenced forever. Among them were families who had sold everything they owned to obtain the papers they believed would save their lives. Businessmen who had spent fortunes on documents promising safe passage to Palestine, community leaders who trusted in their prominence to protect them from the machinery of genocide. The cruel irony of Bergen-Belsen's exchange system became apparent as months passed and promised releases failed to materialize. Of the thousands of Jews brought to the camp as valuable hostages, only around 2,560 would ever actually be transported away and released. The vast majority would remain trapped behind the wire as the camp's character transformed around them, as the relatively tolerable conditions deteriorated into something approaching hell on earth. The prisoners in these early months developed elaborate systems of survival and resistance. Secret schools operated in hidden corners of barracks, where children learned mathematics and literature while guards patrolled outside. Religious ceremonies were conducted with improvised materials, prayers whispered in Hebrew while the SS remained unaware. Cultural life flourished in the shadows, with inmates organising concerts, theatrical performances, and literary discussions that maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanisation. Yet even during this relatively privileged period, death stalked the barracks of Bergen-Belsen. Disease spread easily in overcrowded conditions. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. The psychological stress of indefinite detention took its toll on minds and bodies already traumatized by years of persecution. The camp's hospital, such as it was, could do little to treat conditions that required proper nutrition, clean water, and adequate shelter. The transformation that would turn Bergen-Belsen into a synonymous name for Nazi horror began in March 1944, when the SS established a new section for sick male prisoners from other concentration camps. These were men who could no longer work, who had been deemed expendable by the machinery of slave labour that powered the Nazi war effort. They arrived at Bergen-Belsen not for exchange or temporary detention, but to die. The men's camp became a dumping ground for human wreckage from across the Nazi concentration camp system. Prisoners arrived on cattle cars, packed so tightly that many died during transport. Those who survived the journey stumbled out onto the platform at Bergen-Belsen as walking skeletons, their eyes hollow, their bodies ravaged by months or years of brutal labour and systematic starvation. The SS made no pretense about the purpose of this new section. These men were not expected to recover. They were not valuable for exchange or labour. They were simply waiting to die, warehoused in conditions designed to accelerate that process. The barracks that housed them became laboratories of human degradation, where guards experimented with just how much suffering the human body could endure before finally surrendering. Medical attention was virtually non-existent. Prisoners suffering from tuberculosis lay next to those with typhus, creating perfect conditions for disease to spread like wildfire through the overcrowded dormitories. Men who had once been teachers, merchants, students, and fathers were reduced to fighting over scraps of mouldy bread, their dignity stripped away as systematically as their possessions had been confiscated upon arrival. The arrival of female prisoners in August 1944 marked another escalation in Bergen-Belsen's descent into horror. The women's camp was established with the same cynical efficiency that characterized all SS operations, transforming yet another section of the compound into a holding area for human beings deemed expendable by Nazi racial ideology. Around 9,000 women and girls were eventually imprisoned in this section, their stories as varied as their origins. Some were resistance fighters captured while sabotaging German operations. Others were simply Jewish women swept up in deportation raids across occupied Europe. Many were mothers separated from their children, wives torn from their husbands, daughters who would never see their parents again. The women's camp operated under the same brutal logic as the men's section. Those still capable of work were held temporarily before being shipped to other camps or satellite facilities where they would be worked to death in munitions factories or construction projects. Those too weak or sick to labour were left to deteriorate in conditions that made survival nearly impossible. Female prisoners developed their own networks of mutual support, sharing food when possible, caring for the sick, maintaining sanitation in barracks designed to promote disease. They sang lullabies to comfort terrified children, told stories to distract from hunger pangs, and created makeshift schools where young girls could maintain some connection to the world beyond the wire. Yet these acts of resistance could not overcome the systematic brutality that defined daily existence. Guards selected prisoners randomly for beatings, using any excuse or no excuse at all to inflict violence. Food rations were calculated to maintain just enough strength for basic functioning while ensuring slow starvation. Medical care was reserved for those deemed valuable for future labour, leaving the majority to suffer without treatment for diseases that could have been easily cured under normal circumstances. As 1944 drew to a close, Bergen-Belsen's character underwent its final and most devastating transformation. The advancing Allied and Soviet forces had begun liberating concentration camps across occupied Europe, forcing the SS to evacuate prisoners westward to avoid capture. Bergen-Belsen became a collection point for these death marches, receiving trainload after trainload of human cargo from camps being abandoned across the Reich. The numbers tell only part of the story. Before this massive influx, Bergen-Belsen had housed around 7,300 prisoners in July 1944. By December, that number had risen to 15,000. By February 1945, 22,000 souls were crammed into facilities designed for perhaps 10,000. And by April, when British forces finally arrived, nearly 60,000 prisoners were packed into a space that had become synonymous with human suffering. These new arrivals came from everywhere the Nazi Empire was collapsing. Prisoners from Flossenbürg, Gross-Rosen, Ravensbrück, Neuengamme, Mauthausen and Buchenwald were loaded onto cattle cars for journeys that sometimes lasted weeks. Many died en route, their bodies left to decompose alongside the living in boxcars that had become mobile tombs. Those who survived the transport arrived at Bergen-Belsen as barely recognizable shadows of humanity. The train journeys themselves became instruments of torture. Prisoners were packed so tightly they could not sit down, forced to stand for days while the train crept across a war-torn landscape. No food was provided, no water, no sanitation facilities. The floors became covered with excrement and vomit, creating conditions so appalling that some prisoners begged guards to shoot them rather than continue the journey. Death marches brought additional thousands to Bergen-Belsen's gates. Prisoners who had survived months or years in other camps were forced to walk hundreds of miles in winter weather, wearing inadequate clothing, subsisting on whatever scraps guards might throw at them along the way. Those who collapsed were shot where they fell. Those who survived arrived at Bergen-Belsen in states of exhaustion so complete that many died within hours of reaching what they had hoped might be sanctuary. The camp's infrastructure, never adequate for its intended population, collapsed entirely under this human tsunami. Barracks designed for 50 prisoners now held hundreds. Latrine facilities, already inadequate, became breeding grounds for disease as overwhelmed sewage systems backed up into living areas. The water supply, contaminated by poor sanitation, became a vector for cholera and typhoid fever. Food distribution became a nightmare of logistics and cruelty. The SS made no effort to increase supplies to match the swelling population. Instead, they simply divided already inadequate rations among ever-increasing numbers of prisoners. A bowl of watery soup that might once have sustained a prisoner for a day now had to feed 3 or 4. Bread rations shrank to slivers that could barely be called food. In this environment of absolute desperation, the social bonds that had held prisoner communities together began to fray, and starvation drove people to behaviours they never would have imagined possible. Prisoners stole food from the sick, the strong took from the weak. Guards encouraged this breakdown of solidarity, knowing that prisoners fighting among themselves were less likely to organise resistance. Yet even in these darkest conditions, remarkable acts of humanity continued to illuminate the horror. Prisoners shared their meagre rations with those weaker than themselves. They carried sick comrades when they could barely walk themselves. They whispered words of comfort to the dying, ensuring that no one passed alone into the darkness that was claiming thousands every week. The medical situation became catastrophic beyond description. Bergen-Belsen had never possessed adequate medical facilities, but the massive influx of prisoners overwhelmed even the pretense of healthcare. Typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever and dysentery spread unchecked through barracks where hundreds of prisoners shared spaces with no ventilation, no clean water and no possibility of quarantine. The camp's medical staff, such as they were, consisted of a handful of prisoner doctors working without supplies, without medications, without even the most basic tools needed to treat the epidemic diseases ravaging the population. These physician prisoners found themselves in impossible situations, watching patients die from conditions that could have been treated with simple antibiotics or proper nutrition, resources that simply did not exist within Bergen-Belsen's deliberately neglected medical system. Dr. Fritz Kleen, the SS camp physician, viewed his role not as healer but as administrator of death. He conducted selections among the sick, determining who might still possess enough strength for labour and who should be left to die. His medical decisions were based not on patient needs but on Nazi racial ideology and economic calculations about prisoner utility. Under his supervision, the camp's infirmary became less a place of healing than a waiting room for death. The typhus epidemic that began spreading through Bergen-Belsen in late 1944 transformed the camp into a biological warfare laboratory where the pathogen was the weapon and human beings were the targets. Typhus spreads through body lice, tiny parasites that thrive in the exact conditions the SS had deliberately created: overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate bathing facilities, and the inability to wash clothing or bedding. Within days of infection, victims experienced crushing headaches and muscle pains so severe they could barely move. Fevers spiked to dangerous levels, often reaching 106 degrees Fahrenheit, causing delirium and hallucinations that added psychological torture to physical agony. A distinctive rash appeared across victims' bodies, tiny hemorrhages under the skin that gave patients a mottled, bruised appearance that marked them for death. The battle between life and death typically lasted 2 to 3 weeks, during which prisoners lay helpless in barracks, where the living and dying existed side by side. Without adequate medical care, proper nutrition, or basic sanitation, the mortality rates soared far beyond what typhus normally claimed. In well-supplied civilian populations, perhaps 20% of typhus victims died. In Bergen-Belsen, the percentage was far higher, with thousands succumbing to a disease that modern medicine could easily treat. As typhus spread through the camp like wildfire through dry timber, it created a cascade of additional horrors. Prisoners too weak to leave their bunks soiled themselves where they lay, creating unsanitary conditions that accelerated the spread of other diseases. The dead remained among the living for days or weeks, their bodies becoming breeding grounds for the very lice that spread typhus to new victims. Camp authorities made no serious effort to contain the epidemic. Instead, they seemed to view it as a convenient solution to the problem of overcrowding, allowing disease to accomplish what gas chambers achieved in other concentration camps. Guards refused to enter infected barracks, leaving prisoners to tend their own sick and dispose of their own dead as best they could manage. The psychological impact of watching friends and family members die from typhus added another dimension to the camp's horror. Prisoners who had maintained hope throughout years of persecution found themselves confronting the reality that liberation might come too late. The disease struck randomly, claiming healthy young adults as readily as elderly or sick prisoners, making survival feel like a matter of pure chance rather than strength or willpower. Among the prisoners who arrived at Bergen-Belsen during this catastrophic period were two young sisters whose names would become forever associated with the camp's legacy of suffering. Anne and Margot Frank had been transported from Auschwitz-Birkenau in November 1944, part of the mass evacuation that brought thousands of prisoners westward as Soviet forces advanced. The Frank sisters found themselves in a camp that bore no resemblance to the exchange facility Bergen-Belsen had once been. Gone were the days when prisoners could maintain personal belongings or wear civilian clothes. Gone was any pretense of eventual release or exchange. They had entered a dying place where survival measured itself in hours and days rather than weeks or months. Anne and Margot were housed in one of the tents erected to accommodate the massive influx of new prisoners. These canvas structures provided no protection from the harsh German winter, no insulation from the frozen ground, no barrier against the wind and rain that turned the camp into a sea of mud. The tent floors were covered with straw that teemed with lice, the tiny parasites that carried typhus from victim to victim with mechanical efficiency. The sisters who had hidden in Amsterdam's secret annex, who had maintained hope and humanity through years of concealment, now faced conditions that challenged the very will to live. They had no adequate clothing for winter weather, no clean water for washing, no privacy for basic human functions. The latrine facilities consisted of open ditches that overflowed during rain, creating rivers of human waste that contaminated everything they touched. Food at this stage of Bergen-Belsen's existence barely deserved the name. Prisoners received thin soup made from potato peels and whatever scraps guards might add to the pot. Bread rations had shrunk to portions so small they could be consumed in a single bite. The Frank sisters, like thousands of others, began the slow process of starvation that would claim their lives before spring arrived. Former friends who encountered Anne during these final months described a transformation so complete as to be nearly unrecognizable. The vibrant young woman whose diary would later inspire millions had been reduced to a skeletal figure wrapped in blankets. Her hair gone, her body ravaged by malnutrition and disease. Yet even in these circumstances, witnesses reported that Anne spoke of writing a book based on her diary experiences once the war ended, maintaining hope for a future that would never come. The typhus epidemic that claimed the Frank sisters also took the lives of thousands of other prisoners whose stories remain largely untold. Each death represented not just the loss of an individual life, but the destruction of entire worlds of memory, experience, and potential contribution to human civilization. Children who might have become teachers, scientists, artists, or parents died before they could fulfill any of their possibilities. The camp's administration kept meticulous records of some aspects of prisoner management while ignoring the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding around them. SS officers filed reports about transportation schedules and guard rotations while bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. This bureaucratic precision in the face of massive human suffering revealed the systematic nature of the horror, the way Nazi ideology had created institutions capable of processing death with industrial efficiency. Female SS guards who worked at Bergen-Belsen during this period later claimed they were simply following orders, that they had no choice in how prisoners were treated. Yet witness testimony reveals a different reality, describing guards who seemed to take pleasure in prisoner suffering, who invented creative forms of cruelty, who competed with each other to devise new methods of inflicting pain and humiliation. These women guards, many of them young and from ordinary German families, had been trained to view prisoners as subhuman creatures deserving of whatever treatment they received. The transformation of normal people into instruments of systematic cruelty represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the Nazi concentration camp system, demonstrating how ideology could override basic human empathy and moral restraint. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the death toll at Bergen-Belsen accelerated beyond anything previously recorded. March alone claimed 18,000 lives, a number that represented more deaths in a single month than many concentration camps experienced during their entire existence. The crematorium, never designed to handle such volume, broke down under the load, leaving bodies to accumulate in piles that became landmarks within the camp geography. Mass graves were dug by prisoners too weak to properly inter the dead, creating burial sites that resembled geological formations more than cemeteries. Bodies were layered upon each other without ceremony or individual recognition, the final indignity in lives that had been systematically stripped of all dignity and worth by their captors. The approach of Allied forces created a new dynamic of terror and hope within Bergen-Belsen's wire. Prisoners who had given up all expectation of survival began to whisper rumours of liberation, of armies advancing from the west who might arrive before disease claimed every remaining life. Yet this hope was tempered by the reality that thousands were dying every week, that liberation might come too late for the vast majority of those still clinging to existence. SS guards began preparing for evacuation, burning documents and eliminating evidence of their crimes while continuing to maintain the brutal routine that had characterized camp operations. Some prisoners were selected for transport to other camps further west, death marches that would claim thousands more lives as the Reich collapsed around them. Others, too sick to travel, were simply abandoned to await whatever fate the approaching armies might bring. The final weeks of Bergen-Belsen's existence as a functioning concentration camp witnessed scenes of almost surreal horror. Prisoners who had survived years of persecution died within sight of liberation. The camp's infrastructure collapsed completely, leaving survivors to exist among piles of corpses, drinking contaminated water, subsisting on whatever scraps they could scavenge from the dead. Yet even in these ultimate conditions, remarkable acts of human solidarity continued to occur. Stronger prisoners shared their meagre resources with the weak. Those with medical knowledge provided what care they could without supplies or medications. Religious services were conducted among the dying, offering spiritual comfort when physical relief was impossible. The sound of approaching artillery fire brought both terror and desperate hope to Bergen-Belsen's remaining prisoners. Liberation was coming, but would it arrive in time? And for those who had witnessed such complete breakdown of human civilization, what kind of world would they find beyond the wire? The answers to these questions would soon reshape understanding of what human beings were capable of inflicting upon each other, and what survival truly meant in the face of absolute evil. When British forces finally breached the gates of Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they encountered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 60,000 skeletal figures wandered among mountains of corpses, their humanity stripped away by years of systematic brutality. The liberation came too late for more than 50,000 souls who had perished within those wire boundaries, victims not of gas chambers, but of calculated neglect, disease, and starvation. Bergen-Belsen stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and remarkable resilience. In a place designed to destroy the human spirit, prisoners maintained acts of kindness, shared their final scraps of bread, and whispered prayers of hope, even as death claimed thousands around them. Their stories remind us that dignity can survive even in the darkest corners of human experience. Today, Bergen-Belsen exists as a memorial, its barracks long since burned to prevent disease, its grounds marked by simple monuments to the dead. But its true memorial lives in the testimonies of survivors, in the diary of a young girl who died in a leaking tent, and in our collective determination to remember. For when we forget the depths to which civilization can sink, we risk allowing history's darkest chapters to repeat themselves. The voices of Bergen-Belsen's victims demand that we never forget, that we never allow such darkness to consume our world again.